Executive Director of Missouri Humanities Council. I should say before we get started, Missouri Humanities Council has just done such an extraordinary job of contributing to the bicentennial through the Struggle for Statehood exhibit, Bicentennial Penny Drive, working with the Kinder Institute on Missouri Crisis at 200. This job of taking what is an exceedingly difficult and complicated topic called Missouri statehood and making it accessible has been really an important contribution to the last several years. So thank you very much, Steve, for doing that. Today, though, he is here to talk about Contesting the Constitution, which is a new edited volume that looks into the Missouri statehood process. It's an edited volume, so it's all new scholarship. Is that correct? Yes. Yes, fantastic. Dealing with the statehood struggle. And I appreciate you being here and visiting about it. And so without further ado, Dr. Steve Belko.
Thank you, Michael. Normally I roam around. I can't do that, even though I got a loud mouth here. So I'll got to stay here. I'm not used to doing that, roaming around. So if you catch me doing that and you can't hear me, just holler at me. And I think, too, I forgot the live streaming, so I can't move away from the camera, can I? Just restricting me. It's killing me. I got to move. Yeah, thanks for having me today. So this is a little bit outside Missouri Humanities. It's me as the PhD history, which I love to do most. It is an edited volume. I went out. This is something I've wanted to do a long time. I've read the congressional debates time and time again. I even indexed the congressional debates. So I went out, and that's how I got the other contributors. They said, we're not doing this. We're not reading the stuff. I said, I got an index. We'll do it. But I did several, 2 or 3 chapters in the introduction, but John Eastman, a good friend of mine, Chris Childers, and John Van Atta, and Brooke Poston contributed chapters. What I want to talk about is what's not in the title is that a lot of people, when they think about the Missouri admission crisis, they obviously focus on the slavery issue, and they may not even know what that means. But at heart, let me get this the correct way, the Missouri admission crisis was a constitutional question at heart. That's what it is all about, the Constitution. And that's the reason why Congress is debating Missouri's admission. They are combing through the Constitution. Nearly every single article, section, clause, you name it, was about the Constitution. And what does that mean when that? They're arguing, does Congress have the power to stipulate to a territory some condition or another before it can get a star on the flag? It's never been debated before. For the first time in our history, that's what they're debating. Can Congress, does it have the authority, does it have the power to tell a territory, you must do this first before you can gain statehood into the Union? And that's what this is about. In this particular instance, the Talmadge Amendment. James Talmadge Jr., a New York congressman, added, if Missouri comes into this Union, provided that the further introduction of slavery and voluntary servitude be prohibited, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof into the Union shall be free at the age of 25 years. It's emancipation. It is gradual over time to eliminate slavery, not just in Missouri, but in every territory west of the Mississippi River. That acquired from France, Louisiana Purchase. That is the condition. Now, yes, it has to deal with slavery, but what they're arguing about is a constitutional question. Can Congress do this? And I'm going to let you know, like I said, I've read all the debates and most of the letters attached to it. They are going to comb through the U.S. Constitution. Not since the ratification debates of 1787 to 1788 had some entity, body, ever gone through the Constitution and scrutinized it like this body will. And it just doesn't consume Congress. It will consume state legislatures who will be part of it. The president, his cabinet is involved in this. They argue in cabinet meetings, does Congress have this power? A few of them argue, wait a minute, we're not Congress. Let's just wait until they give us a bill and we either veto it or sign it. So, and that's what added to the intensity of the Missouri admission crisis. When you get to a constitutional crisis which you cannot resolve. Another one will happen nearly 40 years later, the Civil War. 1850s, they're going to comb through that Constitution again, and they can't come to an agreement. So I will add this caveat that slavery is at issue here. But when you read the debates, there are few congressmen who really go after the institution per se. Immoral, got to be out of here. We got to get rid of it. But they will turn back to combing through the Constitution, the various articles. And there are a lot of congressmen, North and South, slavery, anti-slavery, who will try pulling everybody back. Stop berating slavery. This is a constitutional question because slavery is a domestic institution, municipal law. A state determines it. That's it, not Congress. And so slavery becomes not so much the moral issue as much as a constitutional one, because they're going to argue, does the Constitution justify slavery? And a lot of them are going to say yes. And I tell you what, their arguments are tight. They're solid. You can't dispute them. And then there'll be some that say, no, the Constitution does not touch slavery. And you know what? Their arguments are tight, solid, and you can't go against them. So usually when that happens, you go to war. 1860. We might have come close, but it wasn't going to happen. So that's what I want to talk about today and what this book is about. And we comb through this. So Article 4 of the Constitution is the most debated. I'm not going to go, you can read the book. And you can figure out all the other parts. But the chapters are on those that they argued all the time. So nearly every congressman, every one of them, will mention some part of Article 4 of the Constitution, which is really, I don't want to get out of too far here, going back to my scholarly days. Really, Article 4 is a strange part of the Constitution because it's really the only part that you don't know if the federal government is supposed to do this or the states. It doesn't say. And so again, that's why there's going to be this debate. But the very first one, the power to admit new states. Obviously, in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1, new states may be admitted by the Congress into the Union. But you won't believe how they argue over that. Let's start with this word, may. It doesn't say we will, we may. And they're going to argue over what that means. And many of them are going to argue, yes, Congress is the only one that has the power to admit new states. But can we place conditions? And those who argue literally say, no, it doesn't say you can put conditions on there. Others say, well, we may. So they're going to tear this apart. And no one ever comes to any resolution. I'll let you all know this. The Talmadge Amendment doesn't pass. A whole nother compromise comes out of this. But they never resolve these constitutional issues. And so there is I hate to say inevitability. I'm not one of those historians, but a lot of people say Missouri crisis will lead to the Civil War. Well, we never did resolve the constitutional crisis. Everything in this book, everything they argue about, was never resolved. Missouri enters, and we all just disappear and save it for another generation to argue. So this would be the first one, the power to admit new states. And I didn't write this chapter, but one of my good friends did. What they're going to argue in this is history is very important. They're going to go back and they're going to look at, other than the very first 13 states, the first 13 colonies, starting with Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, all the way to Louisiana, were there conditions placed on these states before they entered the Union? And a lot of those who are for the Talmadge Amendment say yes. Look at the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Those states have to, apparently prohibit slavery. But those arguing against the Talmadge Amendment says, no, it doesn't. There was slavery there. Michigan had slavery for a while. Illinois technically had it to 1839. There are no prohibitions. That was the Northwest Ordinance. Some will go so far to say, well, that's not the current Congress. It's of no weight. It doesn't determine anybody else but those states in the Northwest Territory. Missouri is not one of those. Okay? So they're never going to come to any conclusions. Yes, Congress may admit new states, but that's it. And again, they never come to any resolution. Some will say, Kentucky and Tennessee came in. Did they mention anything about slavery? No. We just assumed they would be. So keep in mind, too, that in 1819, Alabama enters the Union without any debate on slavery. None. So why Missouri? I'll save that one for the last slide. We're special. Another section of Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, the power to regulate the territories. Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. Missouri is a territory. Congress governs it. So a lot of those for the Talmadge Amendment say Congress can lay a rule and regulation, emancipation, no more slavery. And those that argue against it say it has nothing to do with slavery, you can't touch it, it's a municipal law. Congress cannot touch slavery, and they'll never come to any resolution. Next section of Article 4, Privileges and Immunities Clause. This will be really debated during the second Missouri admission crisis. Technically, we had two compromises in this. Citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens of the several states. Now, this is, for those who might not know, we had technically two compromises. The first will be Missouri enters the Union, slavery, there's no restriction on slavery. They can do whatever the heck they want with it. But above the 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri, other than Missouri, every state comes in that territory will be free. That below can be slave. It would be Arkansas and Oklahoma. Missouri will write its constitution, send it to Congress, and it starts a whole nother bang, because we had a section in our constitution which empowered our General Assembly to pass a law preventing, quote unquote, free Negroes and mulattoes from coming into this state and settling upon any pretext whatsoever. That's stunning. These are free citizens. Yes, they're black or part black, but they're free. They're not slave. Does Missouri have the right to do that? And though it started a whole other controversy, they were going to reject us, not let us into the Union. It started all these other debates, but this is the key for that second debate. In other words, if you are a free black in Massachusetts, why aren't you a free black in Missouri? Now, keep in mind, other free states had similar laws in the books, and Missouri points that out. Hey, Illinois got one. Indiana's got one of the worst ones, and Iowa eventually will have a bad one. Black codes. And so that was part of the deal. Missouri simply had to promise we would never pass a law enforcing that section of the Constitution. We didn't have to take it out of the Constitution. You just don't pass a law, and if we did pass a law, it had no binding. And obviously Missouri said, sure, passed a solemn act. We'll never enforce that section of the Constitution. We lied. We did it twice before the Civil War. So keep that in mind. My favorite one on this, too, is keep in mind Congress is not declaring us a state. We're not a state in the Union, but to enter the Union, our state assembly has to pass a law. And Missouri's like, you tell us we're not a state, but our state legislature has to pass a law. Yes, sure. So fun stuff, but this is it. The Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Constitution. If you are a free citizen in another state, how can you not be free in Missouri? We never really resolve it. As I said, we'll pass two laws enforcing that section of the Constitution. Despite the promise, we didn't have to. What did Congress do? Nothing. Nothing. So powerful stuff here. Another section of Article 4, the Guarantee Clause. And it's spelled different ways in guarantee, but the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Well, what the heck does that mean? Republican form of government. We're not talking about the Republican Party. It should be a little R. For those who wanted the Talmadge Amendment passed, they argue time and time again that a Republican form of government does not have slavery. Liberty, equality, freedom, all these other stuff. A Republican form of government cannot tolerate slavery. And for those on the other end of the branch that are opposed to the Talmadge Amendment, they're saying, you name a republic in the history of mankind that wasn't founded or based on slavery. And they were right too. How do you argue this? What does a Republican form mean? And they go through these, it is fantastic political theory. For the first time really, since 1788, we're starting to argue, what does a Republican form of government mean? We thought we all had it when we passed the Constitution. No, they're going to argue again and again. I did keep the whole thing on here because if you notice, and on application of the legislature or the executive of the state, blah, 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 against domestic violence, that's argued. Keep in mind, slave insurrection. A governor of South Carolina and its legislature can call upon the President of the United States to send in the U.S. military for an insurrection. And most people are afraid of slave rebellions. They happen. So this is another big argument, is off to the side. So does that mean the federal government protects slavery? Is slavery in the Constitution or not, even though that word's never used? So that's just a little caveat. They're going to argue more and more over all of this. The 3/5 clause, and this is an intense debate. Just basically, for those of you, I'm sure you all know about the 3/5 clause. It was a compromise in the Constitution for For those who were slave states at the time, they wanted all slaves counted for apportionment, things of that nature. For those who were free states, didn't want any slaves counted. They're like, hey, wait a minute, those are slaves. No, people, you just said they weren't. They're property. Arguments get in. We don't count, we count kids and women. They can't vote. So this was a debate. So they decided that, 5 slaves count as 3 people. And for the North, this was a political nightmare to them. If you do look at the Electoral College, that's the reason we have the Virginia dynasty. I'm thinking we'd have still had the Virginia dynasty anyway. It's Virginia, and it's Washington, and Jefferson, and the big boys. But they control, really, the executive branch for a lot of the period prior to the Civil War, because it drives the Electoral College. So the South is weighted in Congress a bit more politically. And for the true Yankees, I got to use that term, that's only New England's, so I'm not throwing out Yankees if you're from Michigan. New England, the Yankees, the capital Y, were really embittered over this. They had the population, but they're losing political power. A lot of people are fleeing the New England states and heading westward. And they're losing political power. And so many of them are not so much anti-slavery as they're anti-slaves. They want free labor, but only for whites. That's kind of the definition of anti-slavery at the time. And I've done dozens of lectures on that from their perspective, but that's what they're quoting. Talmadge, King, all of the prominent congressmen, Senate and in the House, especially from New England, want this sucker gone. If Missouri is slave, if any state entering the Union has slavery, it weights down the political power of New England, the free states. They don't want slavery in Missouri or any other state coming out of that territory because it's against them politically and that power. And so they will go after this. The only way that you have to amend the Constitution to get this out. That's not going to happen. The only way you can water this down is no more slave states. The preponderance of power will be in the free states from this point on. It is a bitter debate, but the 3/5 clause, which is a compromise in the Constitution. Keep in mind, does anybody know, I don't know, this is kind of a little trivia question I'll just throw out here. How many members of Congress do you think during these debates were at Philadelphia Convention? Does anybody know? There were 2. 2 members of Congress were at the Philadelphia Convention. They were there, wrote the Constitution. Neither one agreed during the Missouri admission crisis what happened in Philadelphia. Again, one was Southern, one was Northern. And so they were key to this very compromise. And they butted heads again about 3 decades later. Fun time in Congress. They were a little bit old, so I'm not sure about their ability to remember. But keep in mind, we still had James Madison around, John Jay, other people. So there's a lot of outside of Congress arguing on this. But 3/5 clause will be one of those major debates. And I'm sure if I ask my son sitting back there, what's this clause? He'd go, I have no idea. So most people don't know of what's called the Migration and Importation Clause. Migration or importation of such persons, any of the states now existing something proper to admit, should not be prohibited by Congress the year 1808. That's what I put in it, actually spelled it out. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation. Now, you're looking at something that you might think is innocuous. They pulled this apart by the words. Okay, for example, what does migration mean? Well, they all agreed what importation means, bringing people elsewhere into the United States. What's migration mean? If you go back to the constitutional debates, this word is never debated. At the closest, it's immigrated with an E. It's never debated, no migration. And suddenly, when the Committee of Style writes this Constitution, in comes this word migration. And there's debate on why they put that in there. So those opposed to the Talmadge Amendment, opposed to the restriction of slavery, are going to say, well, it means white folk. And there's an argument behind that. We can't limit Europeans moving through the nation. And those who want the Talmadge Amendment are going to say, movement of slaves. You can't take them anywhere. Congress has that power to restrict them moving through the state. And no one can go back to the Constitution. So, such persons, what the hell does that mean? We can't use slavery in the Constitution. We don't. But everybody knew what such persons meant. But it doesn't say slaves. Okay? Well, I wrote a biography of a congressman who was part of these debates, and he was a lawyer, so he's very good at what he does. How about the word admit? His argument was that's coming into the Union. So they're arguing that migration means from foreign territory into the United States. Migration here. He argued, he goes, you can't admit somebody who's already admitted. Once you're in the country, you're already admitted. So migration means from foreign territory here, and it applies to Europeans, those who are not slaves. They're going to come back and question that in the North and say, well, wait a minute. You can't tax free people. You can only tax slaves. And we do get rid of the slave trade in 1808, by the way. That was not a debate. We lived up to that aspect in 1808. But now the question is can you move slaves from one state into a territory or from one state to another? And they're going to argue over that. Keep in mind, those who want the Talmadge Amendment, there's another clause in here. States now existing. What's that mean? In 1788, there are 13, soon to be 14. The states now existing. It doesn't apply to Missouri. They're going to argue it doesn't apply to Mississippi. It doesn't apply to Alabama. But they can't fight that one. They are pulling this apart left and right. And as I said, the tax or duty. Can you tax a human being? If it's a slave, you can. If it's free, you cannot. So they're going to, and trust me, they're going to pull different phrases out of this left and right. And neither side ever come to an agreement. The only way this clause, which is still in the United States Constitution, disappears is when 600 and some thousand men go to their death. Civil War. That's the only way that this is negated. That and the 3/5 clause as well. So this is just one example of what do you mean by certain words? Just the words alone. What does admit mean? Such persons, states now existing, and they'll never resolve it. Like I said, the Civil War will get rid of this one. Finally, the treaty-making power. We know that the President and the Senate make a treaty. So what is so bad about this one? What has to do with the Louisiana Purchase territory? Article 3. I got to read the whole thing. The inhabitants of the ceded territory shall be incorporated in the Union of the United States and been as soon as possible according to the principles of the federal Constitution, the enjoyment of all these rights, advantages, and immunities, citizens of the United States, and in the meantime, they shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and the religion which they profess. Oh, if you're a lawyer, you love this article. They pick it apart word by word and clause by clause. Here's one of my favorite ones. For the House of Representatives, this doesn't hold any weight. This is the Senate and the President, not us. We don't have to appropriate funds. We don't have to do anything that we feel that we disagree with. We weren't part of the treaty. Powerful statements going on, especially in the House, where some of the free states have that advantage. So I would be here for an hour going over this. So, for example, the inhabitants of the ceded territory. Let me just start with that. What's that mean? Those who want the Talmadge Amendment goes, it doesn't apply to Missouri at this time because none of them are the original inhabitants. They moved here. These white folk immigrated. They're not the original inhabitants. This is only for those who are of French, Spanish, British, whatever, when we acquired Louisiana. It doesn't apply. As soon as this treaty goes, any American moving across the Mississippi River doesn't apply to you, which is about 99% of Missourians at the time. So, shall be incorporated into the Union. Oh, what the heck does that mean? For those who are opposed to, who want Missouri coming in without restriction, it's a statehood. Incorporated into the Union. Give them a star. What are we waiting on? And some will argue that's not what it means, because it could be a territory. And if you remember Article 4, we may admit a state. We don't have to. Admit it as soon as possible. Oh, does that mean right now? There's going to be a lot of those arguing. Hey, keep in mind, a treaty is, the supremacy clause covers the treaty. It is the supreme law of the land, something we must honor with foreign territory. foreign countries, France in this instance, which is funny because it really wasn't France's to sell, but we're going to argue that. Incorporate in the Union, admitted as soon as possible. Do you have to be a state? Can you be a territory? What does that mean? For those who are opposed to Missouri statehood as slavery, they're going to argue, well, they're in it. We bought it. It's a union. They're in. It doesn't have to be a state. It can be a territory. And then they'll argue different parts of Article 4, how to regulate slavery and things of that nature. According to the principles of the federal Constitution, here comes the slavery issue, the Republican form of government. The principles of the federal Constitution. It's funny here because arguments flip. Some will argue slavery is protected by the Constitution, backflip. And those who say it's not in it, go over and flip to the other side. In other words, those who are literally reading the Constitution now do it broadly. For example, is slavery in the federal Constitution? I defy you to find the word slavery in there. I mean, there's a fugitive wink, wink slave clause, but we don't say slave. So they're going to argue the principles of the federal Constitution. Slavery is not a protected institution. So we can tack the Talmadge Amendment on here and still live up to this treaty. And there'll be those who oppose that. No, you can't. Slavery is protected by the U.S. Constitution, and I will show you these clauses that do that. Enjoyment of all these rights, advantages, and immunities of citizens of the United States. Well, is slaveholding one of these? Is slaveholding a right? They're going to argue that. It is not a right. Some will say human bondage is not a right, not a privilege, immunity, any of this. Others argue it is. Fifth Amendment of the Constitution protects property. They're going to argue over all of that. In the meantime, they should be maintained and protected and free enjoyment of their liberty, property, and religion which they profess. Obviously, the word property is powerful. And it comes back to what is the definition of a slave. And it goes back to the Fifth Amendment and right on to the Civil War with this. So, and there's other ways they pick this apart. And here's one that's not even in there or in the Constitution and became a very, very powerful argument. Do you remember that clause, states now existing? Why didn't they argue about Alabama slavery? Everybody knew they're coming in slave. Why didn't Talmadge vote against it? And keep in mind, those who are favoring the Talmadge Amendment, who want slavery abolished west of the Mississippi, every one of them try to tell their southern compatriots or whatever in Congress, we do not, will not, and cannot touch slavery where it exists. They were adamant on it. To the point we're going to try to pass an amendment someday to the Constitution that slavery where it exists cannot be touched. They're arguing over there. Why is it different with Missouri? And the reason is we're not original. We're not American. We were never English. Keep in mind what we got from England after the Revolution, independence, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 was a territory from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, minus Florida, and between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. At no point is Missouri anywhere in that. And that will be a major argument. And in fact, that actually became an argument in 1803 and 1804 about the treaty at the time. Congress was debating it about the treaty. Can we do this? This is foreign territory. It is a major issue of the day. And it resurfaces in 1819 and 1820. It's not an original state. We can place conditions on them. This is not original territory. That's powerful. And the states now existing thing, not only are there 13, but any state that comes into this union, east, within that little, orange area, that's original. The states that come in are not equal. And they'll argue that again and again. And in Missouri's bill, it will say Missouri will come in on equal footing. They had to put that in there. We come into union on equal footing with the original states. Just little things like that. So, this is because we are, other than Louisiana, part of it's east of the Mississippi, by the way, which never was any trouble in this. Missouri is a whole different deal. This is acquired territory. It's foreign territory. And they're going to argue right down, well, okay, so we acquired foreign territory. If we allow slavery, that means the Constitution enslaved. And we can't do that. Well, there's slavery already in Missouri. What do we do about that? So this is just a powerful statement. So what I did is just went over these chapters. I just gave you those clauses of the Constitution which they argued every day through this debate. I can't imagine, in fact, if I remember, there's not a single congressman that doesn't touch any of those. And they're beautiful arguments. I mean, Judge Limbaugh wouldn't know what to do. They're both right. It's 50-50. But Missouri comes in anyway. So there are, if you read through the debates, some fantastic, every argument brings up this period of the founding of America, back to the Revolutionary period and into the founding era. There are those who will look at the Constitution and read it strictly. And there are those who give it a little more broad powers. Okay, we know that happens even today, but it's very powerful prior to the Civil War during the antebellum period. And every argument deals with this. And I will say this, there's no consistency. Even Philip Pendleton Barber, the guy I wrote a biography on, drives me nuts sometimes. He's not consistent. He'll argue something, and it's strict reading of the Constitution. And some other day, when they're on some other section of the Constitution, they're going to read something into it, like, hey, and they're calling each other out on this. But everybody's guilty, so that's, it's congressmen, so they're kind of fun with that. Hope there's no congressmen in here. I don't want to lose our funding. But the General Welfare Clause came up all the time, which is in Article 1. Congress has the power to lay taxes, yada, 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 for the general welfare of the nation. Well, general welfare, we don't want slavery. So we have that power. Necessary and Proper Clause, that's the last part of Article 1, Section 8, I believe, that Congress has the power to pass what is ever necessary and proper to enforce all the stipulations prior to this. What's that mean? If it's necessary and proper to carry out the powers of Congress, how far can we go? It's a whole Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian debate all coming on here now. The 10th Amendment comes up a lot, especially by those who do not want slavery restriction in Missouri. Because why? Missouri, coming in as a state, is sovereign. It's a sovereign state. The 10th Amendment protects it. And slavery is a municipal piece of legislation, state-driven. So the 9th Amendment comes up a lot, too. It's really the first time we ever bring up the 9th Amendment. But that one's in there, too. The Commerce Clause. This is one of the early times where the commerce, this is like, this is very John Marshall, who really empowered the federal government by using the Commerce Clause. Well, it's also in the Missouri debates. How far does Congress control commerce? Not interstate, but also intrastate. Can they do it? Some argue, you bet. Congress has the power to regulate commerce in property. And slaves are property. So keep in mind, those who want to argue slaves are not property, they're human beings, suddenly now they're property because they can be regulated. So they're flipping all through this. And for the first time, really, at least I think, the preamble. And the reason I put this in here, and it is powerful, there are congressmen arguing that the preamble to the Constitution empowers the federal government pretty much to do whatever it wants, including its own safety. Now, during the Civil War, there are a lot of constitutional theorists, William Whiting, Timothy Farr, they'll produce these lectures and books, and they'll base everything the Union is doing, all of that, on preserving the Union on the preamble. That gives Congress essentially plenary powers. They're going to argue that here. Not a lot of them, but some are going to say, we have the power to place the Talmadge Amendment. We do have that power because of the preamble. And it scared the snot out of a lot of congressmen. I went, whoa, let's keep this one buried. We don't want to bring this up again, and we do during the Civil War. And it's called the Adequacy of the Constitution theory that comes out of the Civil War. This is the first hint of it, Missouri, and we don't touch it again. Okay, so it is powerful, but the strict construction versus implied powers. The nature of the Union becomes a massive debate. Are we a consolidated government? Oh, are we a confederation? The main argument is we are a confederation. States are sovereign. The only thing they can't do is explicitly listed in the Constitution. Things they gave up. Things Congress can do, Article 1. Things, Section 8. Things they gave up, Article 1, Section 9. That's it. But we are not a consolidated nation. We are not Washington being supreme and really states being administrative units. But you start to hear that. And there are congressmen, especially from New England, argue we are a nation. We are not a confederation of states. It is a nation. States' rights versus, nationalism. Here it is. This is a major debate. Are states sovereign? Or are they just administrative units of the national government? So that'll be relived. How about the location of sovereignty? Who's sovereign? Who ultimately holds the power in the nation? And they'll argue, of course, we got the popular sovereignty. That'll be a major theme. It's in the people, not the states, not the federal government. They're agents of the people. And so that argument is we can't restrict Missourians. They're sovereign. Only they can restrict slavery. They can keep it, abolish it, alter it, whatever they want. They're the ones that have that. Now, of course, there are those that say the people of the states. But there are people also who argue that, we are a consolidation, so all the people have a right to vote on this. And that kind of goes back to James Otis, and all that, to the American Revolution. Sovereignty lies in the people. But there are those who argue, no, it resolves in the state governments who represent the people in their state. They're sovereign. So we can't touch slavery. It's up to the sovereign people of that sovereign state. And of course, we got the old federalism idea here that, no, sovereignty resides. And we start to see some of these, especially from New England, say, no, sovereignty resides in the Constitution and thus in the federal government. So all these powerful arguments are coming out of these debates. And then my favorite one is if I had $1 for everybody they brought up, and I list them in there. I decided I'm just going to list some of these people. I mean, Moses, Abraham, Napoleon. I'm going to forget some of these. Everybody's brought up. I had to go look up some of these people. But just like our founding fathers, who really based everything they did on history, political theory, political thinkers, the Bible, things of that nature, we never had a greater generation of historians than that, but we will have it here in the Missouri debate. They base all their arguments, no matter if they're technical, on these sections of the Constitution. They'll invoke history. Publius, the Federalist Papers are the favorite, and it's not famous number 10, usually 42 and 45 come up a lot. They'll quote John Jay in Hamilton, things of that nature. So really Publius is, but they come up with everybody. Montesquieu, Grotius, you name it. I list them all in there. You don't have to buy the book, you can just go out and read the introduction quickly. But it's fascinating to hear who they are defending. And there are some that will invoke the same Federalist paper to oppose each other. Fascinating. But like I said, the biblical authorities are about in third. They're characters from literature. I think there's some Dickens characters they bring up. So they name everybody pretty much and call each other names and all of that. So it is fascinating that these aren't ignorant folks. And I do have a little caveat, and I do put this in the introduction. We base these on the congressional speeches. Right? That's not complete. There weren't good recordings of it. So there's a plethora of them. There's like 5-inch binders, 2 or 3 of them of those. But we can't find Henry Clay's. We can only know what he said from what others repeated or other newspapers. Okay, and he's a powerful, he's the reason for the Missouri Compromises, Henry Clay. And there's when you read through it, they may say, gave a speech for 3 hours. I don't know what he said. There are sometimes we couldn't hear over the din of the conversation from other people, so this guy just spoke. So we got to be careful with that. There's a lot missing. Usually, and also too, a political speech can be different than what you say in a letter to a friend. But when we go back and look at what the state legislatures are saying about this, it's common. It fits in with those larger arguments. So I always want to throw that caveat on. As an historian, we only know about 1% of our history at best at a time. But what we found in these is the constitutional question is strewn throughout and is a very, very powerful argument. So we always got to keep that in mind. Yes, it is about slavery, but within a constitutional sense. So I think I better quit now. So if we have questions. So can I move this around? You're going to lose me if I move this around, right? Does anybody have any questions? Oh, good. I like that. Oh, okay. No. Yes.
Meaning to municipal utter.
Yeah, I'm using the term that they would have used in 18 teens, 1820, and it's a very legalistic term. I know, like Philip Pendleton Barber, I wrote a biography on him, and a lot of folks like him. Municipal legislation means local, and local in the largest sense. In other words, state. It's not congressional. Congress cannot touch it. Federal, anything, touch it. Not the executive, anybody. So it is up to a state legislature, but really even then, it is of a locale. Municipal meaning local. It's not a national. And I'm not a trained lawyer, constitutional historian. That's why I never got wealthy. Anybody else have any questions or anything? It's, uh-oh. Now I'm in trouble.
Steve, I might add one thing, because I've done a research using your book, too. I wanted to find out how Daniel Pope Cook contributed to the debates, and sure enough, you've got him cited several times in your book. Well, he railed against Missouri coming in. Daniel Pope Cook was the first representative to Congress from the new state of Illinois. He railed against Missouri's admission into the Union as a slave state, or as an unrestricted state, is more apt. But what was interesting to me, that he called out in one of the speeches, a 27-page speech that I've read, single-spaced, it was one of those hour-long deals.
Yeah.
He called out his own relatives who were in Missouri who were slaveholders. Two of those people, John Dillard Cook and Nathaniel Cook, were members of the Missouri Constitutional Convention in 1820, pro-slavery, and the families were split apart over the debate.
Yeah, and technically, if you want to look at it this way, keep in mind that the amendment that is passed as part of the Missouri Compromise is the Thomas Amendment. Jesse B. Thomas, one of the Illinois senators. So even Missouri is and actually the funny thing is you mentioned Cook. I don't want to get too far out of hand. The 1824 election, we all know Jackson won. He just didn't have the majority, so the House of Representatives said, let's give it to Adams. Cook was key to that, and he actually comes out and makes himself at times look pro-slavery in parts of these debates. So yeah, if you do read, there are personal animosities, and they do get into that. Keep in mind, let me just kind of give you an example of that. For example, where did Missouri kind of stand in all of this? We're angry as snot. We just went into the Union. And slavery's not really that, 10% of the population own slaves and 90% vote to be slave. Of course, a lot of them are from Kentucky and Tennessee and everything. But for Missouri, the issue is ultimately economic. What do we want to do? We want to develop our state, clear it, build it, plant it, all of that. So the question is, for those who are against any restriction, they don't have to be pro-slavery. They just realize that slavery is another form of economic basis, whatever. And so why prevent, we want every type of economy coming in and developing. Why exclude one? Okay. On the flip side of that, there are people who are very pro-restriction to slavery for a variety of reasons. One is it's not a very good economic system. It's destructive. Look what's going on in Virginia, Maryland. We don't want that here. Fur trade is big. And not only that, we like the small farmer. That's the kind of Jacksonian movement. We don't like a frickin' moneyed aristocracy. And who is the greatest moneyed aristocracy in the United States? The slaveholder. We don't want them in here. We want free labor, but free white labor, and no slavery. So some of these, that comes down to how they're going to argue for the Talmadge Amendment. And then they may flip later on another issue, maybe when it comes to movement of free blacks and things of that nature, or their rights. So it's fascinating. And just a little note on that, we haven't done this because I always tell y'all we have real jobs. This was on the side. This was fun as the scholars. Me and the other three of the four, are thinking about another volume. And we were going to pick our 3 favorite speeches. What, to us, are the most powerful speeches and annotate them. I think I talked to you about this, but we never gone any further with it. Too much work. We got real jobs. And the funny thing is, we all got together, and it would be a fascinating book because rarely do we ever pick the same person. Why we think these speeches are the most powerful. And so we orchestrated a little bit. We did pick our 3. So if you want us to do that, fine, we'll do it. It's just a lot of work. And I don't know if you want to publish it. But part of those speeches are because of inconsistencies, personal animosities, economic their pocketbook values come into play and all of that. But also too is how does it fit into here. So it was really neat reading them. So anybody else got one? You got me forever, I guess. I don't know. Till lunch. So I guess you got to go buy the book, right? So, but if I don't say this now, I'll forget. But thank you for coming and listening to this. Thanks for the State Historical Society and everything they've done with the Bicentennial and the Bicentennial Commission. It's been a long ride, and I think I speak for a lot of us. Say we just want it over. We love our state and the Bicentennial, but woo, man, I think it took us longer to do the Bicentennial than it did getting the Union. But not as contentious, so I will say that. So it's been fun working with a lot of the folks I see in the room here on the commission and all that. So it's easy to get a hold of me. Just go to our website, Missouri Humanities. If you had any follow-up questions, I do get those. Just email me. I may not have an answer, or I'll make one up, but if you have anything follow-up, please let me know. But I do want to also credit the other contributors. They're fantastic scholars. I'd like to do something more with them. So is that good? All right. Thank you.